So we talked about this example of an epigenetic modification where the maternal behavior affects methylation of a particular gene, in this case, that makes the animals, that affects the animal's stress response in adulthood. And uh, mothers that don't provide very much stimulation, very much grooming, very much care, their offspring end up with these methylations in their glucocorticoid receptor gene, and that makes them more responsive to stress in adulthood. Whereas if the mother is an attentive mother, the methylation doesn't happen, the gene is expressed at a higher level, and the animal is therefore acts less anxious in stressful situation. And this is known as an epigenetic modification, and in this case, it's being uh, put put there by the mother and by her maternal care. And there's evidence that something like this might be going on in humans too, because when people did a study where they looked at the brains of suicide victims who presumably were feeling pretty stressed out at the time they took their lives, and they looked in the hypothalamus and looked at the same gene in these suicide victims, and they found that, in fact, a lot of them had high methylation of the gene in the suicide victims compared to a control group. More tellingly, though, when they looked at the cases of suicide, they found that this additional methylation that happened was only seen in those suicide victims who had a history of abuse, or child neglect when they were growing up. And other suicide victims who did not have that history, their gene was no more methylated than the control group. And so the researchers suggested that it could be that in humans too, a neglected childhood or abusive childhood might result in methylation of this region and might make the individuals more prone to anxiety and depression and might have contributed to their suicide. The explanation for those who did not have an abusive history as children or neglect as children would be that their suicides was not a response to methylation here, but rather was a more impulsive act. And we do know that a lot of suicides are impulsive acts. So this epigenetic modification, I wanted to point out to you that what epigenetic means has changed over the years. Remember earlier we talked about epigenesis as a term that was used by people translating Aristotle to talk about the increased complexity that he saw in chick embryos. And we used it, for a while, it was a term that basically meant the opposite of preformationism. And then there was a while in the mid 20th century when epigenetic, so once preformationism was dead, then epigenetic was available to be used for other purposes. And in the mid 20th century or so, people started finding changes in, for example, the methylation of a gene that was sometimes inherited. So if it got methylated in the parent, then the parent would pass that on to its offspring, and therefore that would be an epigenetic effect. And at that point, the idea was it had to be inherited. That was the crucial thing that made it an epigenetic change as opposed to something else. But now there's that idea that it has to be inherited seems to have fallen by the wayside. And so now there's a rising use of the term to mean anything that changes the extent of gene expression, whether it's inherited by offspring or not. And that's sort of a slippery slope. I mean, once you start saying it's any alteration in gene expression, well, everything in our class so far has been about how during development, the pattern of gene expression shown by various cells changes in part because of influences from other cells and hormones and things like that. So, in fact, there's no change that happens, no significant change that happens to a cell, probably, that doesn't involve the alteration of expression of some gene or other. And yet, in the literature, if you look at in English, epigenetic, it's really definitely taking off these days. And here we can look at the term in PubMed in terms of biomedical science articles that reference to it. And even though the concept of inherited epigenetic changes, it was there, in the 60s and 70s. It's really become very faddish now, and the number of articles that say that they're about epigenetic changes is kind of skyrocketing. So, in fact, I think this might be another situation where the definition has become so vague that people use it. Often they don't define what they mean when they use it. And there may be a situation where the author may mean one thing by the term, but the reader may interpret it as being something else. Anyway, not a good situation in my opinion. And then the last thing I want to talk about, since we're talking about maternal behavior, is an inadvertent experiment in the role of experience in human infant development. So people had noticed a long time that if we keep track of infants and have these milestones of when they first roll from their belly to their back, or when they back to belly and sit and things like this, that across a lot of different cultures, a lot of different individuals, there's a very particular pattern of development, of motor development in babies that's normally seen. Well, starting back in the 1990s, there was the United States engaged in an inadvertent experiment where they were going to systematically change the experience of millions of infants, and that was in trying to combat sudden infant death syndrome, or SIDS. So sudden infant death syndrome, if you haven't heard of it already, is something that happens where it's almost exclusively in children that are babies that are under a year of age. And it's more common in boys than in girls. And it's just that you put the baby down to nap or to sleep. And sometime during the sleep period, it stops breathing for reasons that no one really understands. We do know that if there's a cigarette smoker in the house, that doubles the risk of SIDS. But eventually, scientists realized that SIDS was much more common if babies were laid on their bellies to sleep rather than on their backs. And so in the 1992, they started a campaign called a Back to Sleep campaign, headed by National Institutes of Health, where they urged parents to put their infants under a year of age on their backs to sleep. And look at this unbelievable decline in the number of cases of SIDS that happened to it. So this very simple manipulation has already saved the lives of tens of thousands of infants in the United States alone. Well, and so people realized that there was a possibility to study here to compare those children that have been put to sleep on their backs versus children who have been put to sleep on their bellies. And it turns out that the children that were put on their backs to sleep, in fact, they are somewhat delayed for several developmental motor landmark milestones, etc. And so for walking independently, or pulling up to stand, for learning how to roll from their belly to their back, well, of course, if they're not put on their belly, they're not going to learn that as well. The dark marks here, by the way, are the average, and the whole length of the bar is the range of these infants. And for creeping around, notice that's a big delay in creeping, because of course the baby doesn't get that much experience being on its belly in a crib, having woken up and asking, seeking attention and stuff like that. So in fact, here was a simple case of what looks like pretty, one might be tempted to call it innate behavior, but in fact, that doesn't mean that it's immune to experience. And if you change the experience of the babies, then the behavior will be significantly affected by that. And so here's another example where what might seem quite well programmed, and these landmarks about when they happened had been established in databases with many thousands of infants. It sure looked quite static and quite fixed. But in fact, if you did the right sort of manipulation, it turned out that could be adjusted some. All right. So I don't know if you're listening this before you've had your Thanksgiving feast or after. In either case, I hope it was really great. And we'll see you um, um, on the, let me see, the Tuesday after Thanksgiving. I hope you have a great time. See you then. Bye.